Joking around with the much superior David, who's here this morning, about how I can't even believe we're doing something different other than the overall plan of redemption, the scheme of redemption. That was a very long-term study that we had going on. Good news for this Ecclesiastes class, this is 1/4. It is going to be 1/4. So it's going to be a quick dopamine hit of Ecclesiastes and we'll be out of here. And so I think it's going to be 12 weeks exactly. And there's 12 chapters in Ecclesiastes. So maybe in the middle in 4 or 5 or 5 and 6, we're probably going to do 2 chapters at the same time. But I am so excited to jump into Ecclesiastes this morning. For a long time, Ecclesiastes was my absolute favorite book in the entire Bible. And I think especially as a teenager, when I was reading through Ecclesiastes, I was like, all right, this is exactly the way I feel about a lot of stuff. You know, when you're a teenager and you think you know everything and everything is dumb, everything everywhere is dumb. I was like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I'm talking about. That's what I need. And there's just so much great wisdom in here. I've talked to several people about the book of Ecclesiastes, and I found that there's a lot of people who really don't like it. I used to ask people, like, do you like this? I'm not going to do that because people are like, oh, you don't like a book of the Bible? I don't mean that. But for some people, reading through Ecclesiastes, it's really depressing. It really makes people feel worse. And I can understand that along the way. But if you get to the end, it's not bad. I promise it's not bad. And so I'm really excited to get into it. Before we even jump into sort of what I've got planned to get rolling with this quarter, are there any thoughts or anything just on Ecclesiastes in general that anybody has?
Studied some with the hospital. There's a lot of practical applications to that issue. There's a lot of practical applications in my group as a older kid who father and grandfather. So I look forward to learning one of them.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, especially the part about for every age group, there's something there. I'll be honest with you, I think that's a great segue into this. I feel kind of weird teaching Ecclesiastes because when you get to chapter 12, it's like, how is a 27-year-old guy going to talk about chapter 12, about aging, getting older, and all the things that I can't, I can't talk about it from my knowledge. I can talk about it from what the scriptures say. And so it's kind of weird for me, but it's going to be great because I think all along the way, there are great lessons for every age group. Anything else before we dive in? Okay. Well, I've got this subtitle for Ecclesiastes, Man's Search for Meaning. And if you've read the book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, it is just exactly the same as what we're going to be talking about with Ecclesiastes. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish man who suffered during the Holocaust. And he was also a psychologist. And so he noticed that there were many people during the Holocaust who it wasn't when they were at their physical weakest, it wasn't when they were completely malnourished that people would die off. It was when they suffered a lack of meaning in their life. Whenever they stopped fighting, that's when they would die. And if you haven't read that book, it's a wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. But I also think it's really good for the book of Ecclesiastes because as we're going to get into it just a little bit more, one of the chief things is there meaning in life? In all of the things that we experience, the things that happen under the sun, is there any meaning to this physical existence is sort of what the writer explores. And so before we even keep going into any of that, what even is an Ecclesiastes? Like for so many of these books of the Bible, you look at it and it's like, okay, Joshua, that's a guy's name. That's probably the guy who we're going to learn about, whatever. And then we get to this one and it's like Ecclesiastes. Does anybody just know what an Ecclesiastes is? It's a teacher. Yeah, absolutely. Somebody else was saying something. Vanity. That's going to be a really important word for it, absolutely. But the word itself, Ecclesiastes, this was fascinating to me. In the Greek version of Ecclesiastes, you'll find that word several times. It's actually ecclesiastou. But if you look in the Hebrew, the word is kohelet that shows up over and over. It shows up 7 times in this book. And it really isn't found in any other biblical literature, which is fascinating. The word itself translates to preacher or teacher. Preacher or teacher. And as a noun, it designates the speaker, and it also gives the name Kohelet or Ecclesiastes, which is preacher or teacher, to the book itself. And it's just fascinating that the Greek word here is one who speaks to the assembly. I want to go to the passages that use the word because I think letting the scriptures define the scriptures is good for us. So look at chapter 1, verse 1, Ecclesiastes 1, verse 1. The words of the preacher. That's the word Ecclesiastes. That's the word ecclesiastou, or in Hebrew, Koheleth, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. But also go to chapter 7, please. Chapter 7, and we'll go down to verse 27. Chapter 7, verse 27. Chapter 7, verse 27, and it reads, "Behold, I have discovered this," says the preacher. Does anybody's translation there say teacher instead of preacher? Yes? Okay, yeah. So someone will say teacher there. And there are very literal, like hyper literal translations that will say the one who speaks to the assembly says. That's kind of a hard thing to parse out there. Adding one thing to another to find an explanation. Look at chapter 12 and verse 8 and 9. Chapter 12. And let's look at verses 8 and 9. We're going to see it a couple times here. This is going right back to Miss Doris's, not Miss Doris, I'm awful, but right back to the vanity. We were talking about vanity. I'm so sorry. Miss Pat, goodness gracious. Oh, I need a drink of water. Chapter 12, verses 8 and 9. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. The preacher, there it is, or the teacher. All is vanity. In addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. He pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. Look down at verse 10 right there. The preacher, or your version might say teacher there, sought to find delightful words and to write the words of truth correctly. So in all of those, that's the word Ecclesiastes. It's ecclesiastou, which in the Hebrew is Kohelet or Kohelet. And so that's where we get the name for this book. I don't know if anybody else even asked that question before, but I remember I was like, what is that? What even is that? And it's the teacher, it's a preacher, one who speaks to the assembly. And so if that's what the book is talking about, the preacher, teacher, one who speaks to the assembly, well, who is that guy? Who wrote the book? Who's the one who's speaking to the assembly? And I'll just put that out there. Who wrote the book? Solomon, yeah, pretty resoundingly. Solomon is usually the person that is thought of here. And Christians and Jews for thousands of years have held that Solomon is the author of the book. And much of that, if you go back to chapter 1, please, much of that comes from the very first verse. You know, we get a lot of details in that very first verse. And in the first verse, it says the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And so when you've got a description like that, well, who is the son of David? Who's the king in Jerusalem? Well, that matches Solomon pretty good there, don't you think? It really matches him well. In chapter 1 and verse 12, look at chapter 1, verse 12. Here's another instance of Koheleth or Ecclesiastou. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. So I think we get even more of a detail because we see in the scriptures plenty of kings said that they were the son of David while not literally being the son of David. So maybe it's one of those. But here we have someone who's been king over Israel in Jerusalem. And so there was only one king after David who was the king over all Israel in Jerusalem. And it's Solomon, because after that, the kingdom divided, and then you have Judah, and then you have Israel in the north. So really, we're nailing this down to Solomon a little bit even more. Look at chapter 1, verse 16. We can see some more details about this teacher, this preacher. In verse 16, I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. My mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. So here, this person's claiming, I have increased in wisdom more than all who were before me. And when you think of a wise king, who do you think of? I mean, you think of Solomon, right? And so it seems like we're narrowing this down even more. And then go back to chapter 12, please. Chapter 12, and we'll go back to verse 9. We read this just a few minutes ago, but I think it's helpful to see all of this. Chapter 12 and verse 9, it says here, in addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. He pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. Something that we know about Solomon is that he wrote all kinds of proverbs. Actually, in our book of Proverbs that we have, I believe all but 2 chapters are attributed to Solomon. And so we know that Solomon wrote many proverbs. And so it sounds like we're bringing it down even more. And I really think the natural reading of the book itself is going to lend us to start thinking about Solomon. And especially if we compare Ecclesiastes to Proverbs or the Song of Songs, it sounds a lot like Ecclesiastes. One of the reasons that people have, well, we'll get to this in just a second, but the way that the writer introduces the teacher or the preacher, or the way that he is talked about, it could allow Solomon to set aside the mantle of king. So it's almost like this isn't a commandment from the king, but this is just wisdom from an older man. And maybe that would be refreshing for him. Any thoughts on that before we talk about another view of who wrote this? Okay. Well, it's fascinating to me that many in the academic world, by the way, we talked about this in the Scheme of Redemption class, a lot of people in the academic world don't have a high view of Scripture, meaning they don't believe that it's Holy Spirit inspired. So there's the whole caveat behind what's about to follow. But many in the academic world don't believe that Solomon wrote the book. And there's several sort of minor differences between people who don't believe that Solomon wrote the book, and I want to go through them because it's almost humorous when we get to the end of what they're talking about. It's going to be funny who I think we're still pointing to. So one of the chief reasons that people don't believe Solomon wrote this book is that the preacher that we've looked at so many of these passages is spoken of in the third person. In the third person. So it doesn't say, I did this, I did that. And they point to chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, 7, 27, 12, 8, 12, 9, and 10. Verses that we just read. One of the problems with that is they've skipped over the ones like verse 12. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. And it's just fascinating to me that we can jump right over some of these other verses. And like in chapter 7, we looked at it just a few minutes ago. Chapter 7 and verse 27, here we see another first person rendering here. Behold, I have discovered this, says the preacher, adding one thing to another to find an explanation. Now they focus more on the says the preacher part and not the I part. And so they say, look, they're quoting something that the preacher said. And I understand it. I understand their logic there. But other reasons suggest that the writer uses idioms or sayings are here that fit better with later Greek times and later writings that maybe don't match up so well with some of Solomon's other writings in his Hebrew. And so based on that, one of the theories is, well, he just had a scribe that dictated what Solomon said. And do we see precedent for that in any of the other scriptures? Absolutely. Scribes just dictating what the person said. But another theory, another framework is that there's an unnamed person who is presenting the teachings of Kohelet, or a wise teacher or a wise preacher. But what's funny to me is even in that view, the majority of people believe that the wise teacher that this person is referring back to is Solomon. So even if Solomon didn't write it, even if it's not one of Solomon's scribes who wrote it, even if it did happen later, really, if you just take a step back from what this argument is, we're still talking about the wisdom of Solomon. And that's just kind of fascinating to me. So I think either, there's really more than one or two, but either view that you have here, we're still talking about the wisdom of Solomon. And so I think there's a lot of comfort, a lot of really rich stuff that we can get from that about Solomon, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But any thoughts on any of that before we keep going? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Think that you could disqualify scripture because one verse doesn't match the letters of another. Foolishness in my mind. The fact that Solomon's voice comes through all different layers of it. People kind of reading the my study Bible has a lot of for each book. And I always different once a year pointed out the possibility this was a rewritten version, or basically a translation earlier.
Yeah.
Bringing some of the inconsistency. Makes perfect sense on this thing going.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's great. What study? Yeah, what study Bible is that? Nice. Yeah, well, that's great. So if you didn't want to listen to me say any of that, get the NIV study Bible and you'll read the same thing. It's great. And I do think it's so helpful to know that even in all of these disagreements that these scholars have. By the way, if you read anything that any biblical scholars say, there's going to be disagreements on just about everything, it seems like. But really, the conclusion ultimately is, even if Solomon didn't literally write this, it's still the wisdom of Solomon. And that's really going to be helpful for us as we go on. Any other thoughts?
They talk with God.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Through a lot of experiences had it, only through God's gift that is.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's somebody listens to well, because of God, but did the right about these things he's wrote, written about. Yeah, those are from God, and I think it's like experience. But it's all from God's revelation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I'm so glad you said that, because if we skip over that, we're going to miss why this even matters in the first place. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I honestly don't remember what's on the next slide, so let's find out. Why is the author important? Okay, why is the author important? We just talked about that. Next. All right, we're going to talk about that just a little bit more. What I want to do now is, before we start looking into the book of Ecclesiastes, I think it's really helpful for us to take just a brief look at Solomon again. And answering the question, why is the author important? This book is really going to be explaining what the meaning of life is from the perspective of somebody who tried everything and said these things matter and these things don't. And so if it was just somebody on the street who's never done a thing in their life, they've never left, I don't even know, I can't think of a good example. They've got a square around them, they've never left that square in their life, and they said, look, these things don't matter, but this thing does. That's not going to mean very much. But let's take a brief look at Solomon, because I think it really is going to emphasize the message of Ecclesiastes. So one is that Solomon, he succeeded his father David, was the king of Israel. He was the last king of the United Kingdom. And let's look over at 1 Kings 3 really briefly here. 1 Kings 3. And 1 Kings 3, we'll go down to verse 5. And we'll read a couple of verses here. This is what Charlie was alluding to just a minute ago about asking God for wisdom. And Solomon was given wisdom from God. And so here in 1 Kings 3, let's look down at, let's see. Let's go down to verse 5. Verse 5. 1 Kings 3, verse 5. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. And God said, ask what you wish me to give you. Then Solomon said, you have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, and that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart, to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? And it was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. God said to him, because you have asked this thing and not asked for yourself long life, nor have you asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I've also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. So Solomon asks for a discerning heart. He asks for wisdom. He asks for understanding. And God gives it to him. But further, God gives him riches, and he gives him peace is what he's going to give him. All kinds of, God gives him what he didn't ask for as well. And I think that's going to be a really big key into going through Ecclesiastes. We'll talk about that more just a little bit, but Solomon's wisdom was shown in several different ways. You know, that classic story of you have these two prostitutes and they both had children. One of them rolled over and killed one of their children, and the other one took the other baby and then gave the other one, am I getting this right? Is this making sense? I need a chart for what I'm saying. The dead child, unfortunately, gives it to the other mom and tries to pretend like this is my child. Well, they take this whole case before Solomon, and Solomon says, give me a sword, cut this baby in half and give him half. And one of them's like, yeah, that's fair. Sounds good to me. He's like, no, no mother would ever do that, and says, give it to the one who said, take my child, because you don't want that child to die. So Solomon's wisdom is shown over and over and over again in ways just like that. And it's really incredible. And Solomon valued this wisdom. If we were to go to the book of Proverbs, what is one of the things that is said over and over again to Solomon's son? Is probably a bad way to ask this question. But one of the things about wisdom that Solomon tells his son over and over and over again. Yeah, listen to the wisdom of your father. He says, if you treasure it, if you value it more than gold, if you follow in these ways, it will prolong your days and your footsteps will be firm. So yeah, absolutely. So Solomon treasured this wisdom that he got from the Lord. He did. And he did many things well. He ruled in peace. He loved the Lord. He built the temple. We also see him being an influence to other nations, like the Queen of Sheba, when she comes up and so impressed. And the Lord has blessed the people for you to be the king here. And Solomon was very, very rich, and he was very well respected. And this is the part that I think we need to look at, just how rich, just how well respected Solomon was. Because I think it provides opportunities for Solomon to do things that nobody else in the world would have been able to do at this time. And so let's take a look at this. How rich was Solomon? Let's look over at 1 Kings chapter 9, please. 1 Kings 9. And let's go down to verse 26. As far as I know, I believe this is the first navy, if you want to call it that, that's mentioned for Israel or Judah specifically. So in 1 Kings 9, look at verse 26. 1 Kings 9:26. King Solomon also built a fleet of ships in Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, sailors who knew the sea, along with the servants of Solomon. They went to Ophir and took 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. 420 talents and brought it to King Solomon of gold. And that's an amazing thing. We're going to look some more at some more numbers and figures. It's really hard with some of these figures of money or valuable precious metals because they change, but I'm real excited to talk about some of the projected numbers given inflation and everything today. So he has this fleet of ships from Hiram, the king of Tyre, who provided the cedar for the temple. Unbelievable ships, unbelievable sailors who know the sea, and they're going out and they're getting wealth for Solomon. Let's look over at chapter 10. Chapter 10 and verse 1. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with different questions. But now, look down at verse, let's see. Look at verse 9. Start verse 9. Blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore, he made you king to do justice and righteousness. Look at verse 10. She gave the king 120 talents of gold, a very great amount of spices and precious stones. Never again did such abundance of spices come in as that which the Queen of Sheba gave King Solomon. Also, the ships of Hiram, we just talked about those a second ago, brought gold from Ophir, brought in from Ophir a very great number of almug trees and precious stones. The king made of the almug trees supports for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also lyres and harps for the singers. Such almug trees have not come in again, nor have they been seen to this day. So, I mean, I want you all to notice how many times we're going to see it was nothing like it and never again. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 13. King Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba all the desire that she requested. Besides, he gave her according to his royal bounty. Then she turned and went to her own land together with her servants. Verse 14. Now the weight of gold which came into Solomon in 1 year, in 1 year, was 666 talents of gold. And by the way, this 666 talents of gold, the estimates are outrageous, but the most recent one I saw was $100 million. In 1 year, 666 talents of gold. We already saw the 420, so maybe a little bit less than that, but this is an unbelievable amount of wealth he's getting. Verse 15, besides that, from the traders and the wares of the merchants and all the kings of the Arabs and the governors of the country, King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, using 600 shekels of gold on each large shield. He made 300 shields of beaten gold, using 3 minas of gold on each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold. There were 6 steps to the throne and a round top to the throne at its rear, arms on each side of the seat, 2 lions standing beside the arms. I mean, this is glorious, majestic kingship here. Verse 20, 12 lions were standing there on the 6 steps on one side and on the other. Nothing like it was made for any other kingdom. Solomon stands out from all of the kingdoms of the world. Verse 21, all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. All the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. Look at this. None was silver. It was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon. Remember, silver is not valuable, but we're going to notice how much silver there was. For the king had at sea the ships of Tarshish with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish came bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. So look at verse 23. King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. Greater than all the kings of the earth in wealth and wisdom. Unbelievable. Let's keep going. All the earth was seeking the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his heart. They brought every man his gift, articles of silver and gold, garments, weapons, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. Now Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. He stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. The king made, look at verse 27. The king made silver as common as stones in Jerusalem, and he made cedars as plentiful as sycamore trees that are in the lowland. So if you remember, silver wasn't really valuable. We saw that back in verse 21. It wasn't considered valuable, but it was so prevalent, it was like the stones in Jerusalem. Unbelievable amount of wealth here. Verse 28, Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and QA, and the king's merchants procured them from QA for a price. A chariot was imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And by the same means, they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and to the kings of the Arameans. And so the reason why I wanted to go through all of these, all of these verses about the wealth of Solomon is that it can't even be numbered. We can't even put a figure on it. Where 666 talents of gold, the most recent one I saw was somewhere around $100 million. How do you put a number value on peacocks and apes, on spices and perfumes? I don't really know how you do that. But the point is, verse 23, King Solomon is greater than all of the kings of the earth at this time in his wealth and in his wisdom. And I think that is just so important. And these numbers that we get, they don't even include the tribute. They don't include the undisclosed amounts that we have from the kings of the Arabs and from the governors there in verses 14 and 15. So it's an unbelievable amount of wealth that Solomon has, and everybody wants to come to him. He's making himself great, and I think that's going to be really, really important. Any thoughts on any of that before we keep going? Yes, ma'am. 25 tons. Do you imagine that? 25 tons of gold every year? Outrageous. Yes, sir.
Oh, again, Solomon and Grant, that was so hard to get understand. That blessing and being spiritual and being um, righteous is not directly reflected with riches and wealth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so it's very hard when you happen to not be one of those people, and it's very easy to question, are you doing right in the sight of God? Okay, but I also like the Solomon always never seemed very clear. Was he given all this because of his righteousness, or is it to contrast that even with this, look how he fell?
And that's where we're going next.
Like that, the real essence of this, that does not necessarily bulletproof to all the temptations of violence. And then sometimes there's just outliers. There's things that are for God's purpose that doesn't necessarily speak to how we should view our lives today. But just because he was blessed, or Abraham was given all the stuff, or Job, doesn't necessarily mean anything for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it's just amazing how 11 starts. But Solomon.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm right there with you. And I think this is going to make Ecclesiastes so much more powerful. There is nobody in the world who is as wealthy or as wise as Solomon at this point. And we know that from what the Holy Spirit's revealed to us. And yet, we're going to see what he does with that and then what his conclusions are going to be from that. So, that, yeah, that's an absolutely great point to make there. Before we get to that point, I think it's so important for us to see he has wealth beyond what anybody else has. He has wisdom beyond what anybody else has, because this means Solomon has access to do things, to do whatever he desires with no limitations. That, I mean, do we see that? There's no limitation to what Solomon could go do. He has all the wealth in the world. He has this honor and status among people, and he's the king of Israel. I mean, who's going to tell him, oh, you better stop that? You know, you don't go after that. No one's going to tell him that. Well, people might, and they should, but he's the king. He can just say, like, I don't need you. Off with your head or whatever like that. And so I think it's so important for us to see this. He has wisdom, he has respect, and he has all the money available to him. Nothing was unavailable to him. He could try anything. He could pay whatever exorbitant amounts of money to try anything to try and find fulfillment in life under the sun. And I think that's so important. And so consequently, with all of the access that he has to anything, no limitations, nobody's stopping him from going after whatever he wants. Look at 1 Kings 11 here. 1 Kings 11. And we'll read these first 8 verses. And this is what our brother Ted was just alluding to a second ago too. 1 Kings 11, let's read these first 8 verses together, please. First 8 verses. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods. His heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. So Solomon, who is given wisdom by God more than anyone before him, more than anyone after him, is not immune to sin. He is not immune to falling prey into the classic choosing his own way rather than choosing the way of the Lord. And notice just how bad it gets too. It's not just that he has 700 wives and 300 concubines. It's that he is supporting idol worship. And it seems like he's participating in idol worship. And it's not just like, oh, maybe he had a little figurine in his house in the corner and, not a big deal. But we see Milcom, we see Chemosh, and we saw Molech. Those 3 for sure we know what was a big part of their worship. Child sacrifice. So these are not just, he's just sort of, the sun's cool, the sky's cool. He is participating and really funding child sacrifice on behalf of these wives that he has that are turning his heart away from the Lord. And so I think that's also so powerful for us. The wisest man who ever existed, and he's not immune to sin. He's not immune to the same problems that we have. He's not immune to any of that stuff, not immune at all. And so as a result of this, look down at verse 9. God is going to take away his kingdom, and it's divided. Look at verse 9. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. I mean, look at that. God had appeared to him twice, and he turned away from him. And he commanded him concerning this thing. He should not go after other gods, but he didn't observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant, my statutes, which I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days. Look at this. Even in this judgment, there's mercy for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. And so God is very displeased. The kingdom is divided. In verses 29 through 38, Jeroboam gets the chance of a lifetime. If he follows the Lord, then God will make him an everlasting house, and he blows that as well. Yes, sir.
We know that the visions were not inspired, they were done by men, and this is all one story. And this to me is one of the best examples of where we need to ignore those chapter divisions. If you go back to chapter 9, where this section really started, and particularly look at what God said in the beginning of verse 3 down through verse 6, he talks about the fact that he's going to establish his kingdom, he's going to establish this covenant with him, if Solomon will keep his commandments and keep his statutes and not go after foreign gods. Everything that we have talked about, his fabulous wealth, his popularity, his acclaim for Queen Sheba, the wives, the horses and the chariots that he was specifically told not to go to Egypt again, he went to Egypt again. All of that is the foundation for what we find here. The fact that Solomon, despite having all of this advantage, does turn away from God. And because of that, the kingdom is taken away from him. And so when we look at the popularity, the acclaim, the wealth, we have to be careful that we don't look at that and say, wow, I wish I had that.
Yeah.
I think the message is actually, no, you don't want to have that, because look what it did to the wisest man who ever lived.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think Ecclesiastes is going to make that point so many times. And I think that's so important that you brought that up. Any other thoughts on that same idea? Okay. One of the things that's important for us, even Solomon, like you were just saying, the wisest man in the world turned away from following God. We don't really know exactly when Ecclesiastes was written. And so it's fascinating. We don't really know, but especially as we get through it and we get to chapter 12, it seems like Solomon is an older man reflecting on his life. And chapter 1 is sort of the prologue, and he's sort of summing up what's about to happen. And so it's possible, we don't know this, we really don't, but in chapter 11, where Solomon turns away from God and all these punishments are given to him, well, God says it's not going to happen in your days. And so there's still days of Solomon's kingdom after this happens. And so it's possible that after this, that was sort of his wake-up call, and he returns to the Lord, and that's where we see him write, Ecclesiastes. That's certainly a possibility. And I think that fits nicely, whether or not it's true, it fits really nicely with a lot of the stuff we're going to see in Ecclesiastes. Solomon was able to try everything, and he did. He went after whatever he desired. And so I think when we read things like, I tried this and it ain't it, it means a lot more coming from Solomon versus, say, me. Like if I said, hey, don't do this because I tried it and that's not it, you're gonna be like, who are you? What have you had access to in your life? How old are you again? It doesn't matter that much. But Solomon has tried everything. He's an older man looking back on his life and saying, that ain't it. And it's going to mean a lot more coming from Solomon. Okay, any thoughts on any of that? Yes, sir.
They allowed for my understanding this thing younger, that the thought I was keeping in mind, well, God granted Solomon all this wisdom. Why did he do all, this big disconnect? And I've kind of settled that. I think even First Kings 3, when God grants him wisdom, see, to me, it may have been specific to the judgment of the people. Maybe I'm wrong, because that's what he asked him. See, I want discretion as a king. I want to get rule over the people. And maybe some of this other wisdom we're hearing from now was through this, it was this painful lessons where wisdom comes from. He didn't grant all his riches at that time, even though he told him your riches were granted. So I've kind of settled that sometimes your wisdom comes painfully. Sometimes we pray to God. James chapter 1, we pray to God. This was clear. It's just, it was hard for me as to figure that out. Not because you be wise. God commanded you do all this. So that's how I've said it. I think God was maybe specific in how part of that portion is how he would rule. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Those mistakes and learn the painful way. So that our young folks should make those mistakes. It's not so and learn.
Yeah, I'm right there with you because especially as we go through Ecclesiastes, some people have described it almost like diary entries. As he's trying these things, he finds out that they don't work, that they're not fulfilling. And it's sort of, you see the progression, even if it's not, it probably wasn't a diary where he was trying something. Oh, I got to write this down really quick. And he goes, try something. Oh, I got to write, probably not like that. But that's sort of the format that we're going to see as we go. So absolutely, I'm with you there. Let's really quickly, because we're running out of time, but the structure of the book, there's a whole bunch of different structures that you can give to it. I'm a big fan of more simple, more better. And so the structure that we're going to kind of use is that chapter 1 to chapter 8, verse 15 is sort of exploring. And you're going to see Solomon tries all kinds of things. You're going to see little glimpses of God mentioned every now and then. But the vast majority of it is going to be, I tried this, I tried this. God sneaks in every now and then, but he's going to say, I tried this. He's exploring everything. But once we get to chapter 8, verse 16, there's this sort of like moment that Solomon has, and he says, you know what? I've discovered that I can't figure this out. And so then he's going to start explaining life's variability, all these things that are inconsistent, these things that don't line up. And we're going to see God shows up more in chapter 8, verse 16 to chapter 12 than he did in chapter 1 through chapter 8, verse 15. And that's fascinating. If we watch how many times God is mentioned, it starts exploding at chapter 8, verse 16. Fascinating stuff to me. Let's look at some other stuff real quick. Some of the key themes of this book, and this is why it's one of my favorites. One of them is just the complexity of the human experience. There are times where it's going to seem like Solomon is absolutely contradicting himself. He's going to say, working under the sun is the worst thing that anybody in this world could do because it profits nothing. You're just going to die and it's going to mean nothing. And then like 6 verses later, he's going to say, it's really good to work hard. It's really good to enjoy the fruits of your labor. That's God's gift for you. Because human experience is complex, isn't it? That's kind of how we live life. It's complex. It's not simple, yes, no, good, bad. It's a time and place for everything, you could say. Another one is the vanity of existence, the uselessness, the emptiness of existence, which is without God, this stuff really is pointless. This stuff that we do under the sun is worthless. It means nothing. And we're going to see that over and over and over again. Another one is the reality of death. The reality of death. I mean, Solomon hits this hard all throughout. He says, you know what? I'm just going to die. So all this stuff that I've built, all this stuff that I've done, I'm just going to die. So what's the big deal? The reality of death is emphasized a lot. The joys and the frustrations of earthly labor. I said that with the complexity of human experience and human existence. And that's absolutely true. We see a lot about earthly labor, and it's fascinating and really fun to get into. And then I think this is the last one, the enjoyment of God's gifts. The enjoyment of what God gives and what he does. And here we go. And the role and fear of God. So God is going to be mentioned several times, but especially chapter 8, verse 16 and onward, it just starts to explode. And I'm really excited to get there. One of the things that I have done, and I just put this up there, you can take this or leave it. I like to mark up my Bible a lot, things that repeat. The one that I really want us to focus on is God and questions. So as you're reading and preparing for each chapter that we're going to do, so when you read chapter 1, I want you to notice when God is mentioned and how God is mentioned. And then notice when Solomon asks questions, because I think these are questions that we ask a lot too. And so it's going to be fascinating for us to see when is God mentioned and then what's the result? And then what are the questions that Solomon was asking? And are they similar to what we ask today? And I think that they absolutely are. I think that's it for that. Let's go to chapter 12 really quickly, please. And I just would be remiss if I didn't mention this. We probably don't have enough time to go through all this, but Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14, I would venture out to say that the majority of the people who are in the room, you know what that says. Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14, where it says, the conclusion when all has been heard is fear God, keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. This applies to every person, for God will bring every act to judgment, every hidden thing, whether good or evil. That is going to be the ultimate conclusion. This is really important. As we're going throughout the book, let's not jump to that over and over and over again. When we're in chapter 2 and things look terrible and things are awful, let's not say, well, we know where this is going to end, so let's kind of like get away from this bad feeling. But let's sit in the bad feelings and the way that things are going to be under the sun. And I think every time I've taught Ecclesiastes, we get to these things where it's not nice, it's not fun. It's like, well, we know where this ends. Yes, we do, but this is human experience. So let's stay and dig into the bad stuff. Okay. Any thoughts or anything before we go? All right. Chapter 1 for next week, Lord willing. Thank you all very much.